Hello and welcome back to Warp Things. My name is Otso and on this channel we do all sorts of Warhammer hobby stuff. Today I'm making a Warhammer Kill team-sized game board. This is my first terrain making video and I will do separate videos of buildings and terrain if this is received well. The setting takes place in a ruined imperial city with some industrial elements like underground pipelines and realistic rubble that adds a narrative flair to all my future skirmishes. Here and there you can spot some unfortunate workers that have hid in the pipes or the service tunnels below as the sirens began to blare. Now the area is uninhabitable and the factories are unusable, but never given freely. This will be my battlefield, where chaos cultists take over and scavengers want to secure everything that isn't bolted down. And the Imperium will defend it tooth and nail. Only in death does duty end. First up, I want to show you something really cool. I commissioned my friend from work to do like a kill team board that is double-sided. It's basically a plywood with cut wood on the sides that he beveled and made very perfect. It's actually really beautiful, and from the bad picture I drew, it's crazy what he delivered. I know he's watching this video, so thank you so much. This is really cool. Today we're gonna be focusing on this side. This side is gonna be an industrial imperial city. Leave a comment down below on what you think is gonna suit on the other side. We're gonna make a separate video from that. I'm gonna be using some XPS foam, and first I will have to figure out how I cut it to size. I think I'm just gonna start measuring and see how it goes. So 56.4, 77 on the dot. God damn, that's like perfect. I'm gonna put this to the side so I don't damage it. Measure twice, cut once, as they say. Yep, that's about it. I think that's about right. A new and fresh knife. There we go. I'm not like cutting straight through the foam because I don't have anything to cover this table with enough. I'm gonna cut like half of it and then I'm just gonna snap the piece off. Let's try the fitment. Whoa! This is why we don't work in the kitchen. Okay, so I have to shave just a bit off because it's gonna be a pressure fit, so we don't want that. We want to glue it down. Okay, so let's shave a bit off. I got a helping kitty cat on my shoulder. She has had this cone for a while. She had a surgery a few days back, but she has been a champion and we can take it off tomorrow, so I bet she's gonna be very happy. Yes, you are. Okay, let me work now. As you know, always cut away from yourself. Probably looks very safe. It was such a beautiful cut at first, but now it's completely ruined, but I think we can work with this. There we go, it fits like a glove with serrated edges. So there's something I want to include in this. That's why the other side is a bit deeper, is that I want to gouge some gaps for pipes in here. I have all these sorts of different, these are like reusable straws, and these are receipt rolls. The place where I work uses a lot of receipts. I've been collecting these for a few years now because I've had this pipe project in mind for a while. So I want to have like the pipe networks going under here, and to make the game board playable and also to make it look more 3D and cool, I want to put this grating on top so it's gonna sit flush. I can place my buildings wherever I want. I think I'm gonna switch the camera angle now as well. You guys probably want to see what I'm doing. I did some live commentary while I was crafting this board, but ended up doing it mostly at night. I didn't want to disturb my girlfriend or my neighbor's sleep, so I decided a voiceover will have to do. The build ended up taking way longer than anticipated, so this is way more coherent as well. I've done some markings on the board already. I have marked the middle point and also the middle tiles on each edge. I also drew a quick sketch on how I want the layout to look like, and I'll use that as a reference. The main flooring is going to be made to look like concrete slabs. That's a look I really like and my default basing scheme. I started by marking a central row of slabs both ways. Then I filled the space with rows of squares that I make somewhat deep with a box cutter. The slabs are 40 by 40 mm in size. Kill team objective tokens are 40 mm in diameter, and having a middle point that is fairly simple to spot makes setting up much faster with no need for measuring. When I got all of the squares marked and cut, I made all of the lines more pronounced by drawing in the gaps with a mechanical pencil. I drew around all of the bricks separately so that the lines don't add up exactly. The ground has been bombed heavily, so it makes sense that some bricks have shifted a bit. When I had all of the bricks marked and drawn out, I wanted to start introducing some damage to the board, using my sketch as a reference. I sketched out the biggest cracks on the board using the pencil and tried not to make it too complicated, so that I know what to cut away and what stays. I did a lot of random small jerks in different directions to make the cracks seem natural. I left some bricks intact too and continued the crack on the other side. I figured it's possible that some of the bricks hadn't given out and the ground just cracked under them or followed the seam in between. I focused the biggest damage on the edges and corners of the board. The middle of the board is going to be the area we're going to be fighting over, and huge craters wouldn't make sense there if there are still buildings intact. Kill team uses a lot of corner wall pieces too. I think if I have a corner piece like this and the building behind it has just vanished, there will be some damage to the ground beyond it too. When I had the areas marked out that I wanted to remove, I started removing them. Cutting out parts of the foam and especially making holes was pretty hard, so I used different ways of removing material. I did some digging with the box cutter, ripped out pieces with my brutal strength, and sometimes used pliers. I initially thought that leaving a base layer of the foam would be easier to build on, but turned out it was a waste of time, and cutting the holes through later allowed me to build the pipeline from below. When I got all of the biggest indents gouged out, I made a lot of smaller cracks around the impact areas. For this, I used my hobby knife and the mechanical pencil in tandem. I did some deep cracks with just the hobby knife, some blunter cracks with the pen, and some very defined deep cracks using both. I added some random splits and cracks all around the board too, with the same techniques. When I had enough cracks on the board, I started adding texture to make the concrete look more like concrete. I saw this tip first on a channel called Good Enough Scenery and thought it looked cool. By dragging a steel wire brush across in straight lines, we get the effect of poured concrete. I did this in both ways and many times, so that I got a lot of shallow texture that doesn't look like I just, dragged steel wire brush across it. I also did some tapping and banging with the same brush for tiny holes and imperfections. This won't show too much after the next step, but at least I know it's there. I had to run to my local grocery store for the next part because I had no aluminium foil at hand. I rolled the foil into a few different sizes of dense balls. It's not the size of the ball, but how you use it that matters. I got the help of my lovely girlfriend as we rolled my balls across all of the flat areas. We varied the pressure, rotated the balls not to repeat the same texture all around, and sometimes just straight up banged my balls across the table for a natural stone texture. Then for some piping. Okay, get your mind out of the gutter. I planned a section where some pipes make a 90-degree turn and one of them continues outward, so I made that part first. The ground shook as I cut my receipt roll in half with an iron saw at a roughly 45-degree angle. Then I cleaned it up with my hobby knife so that it added up well enough. I did the same with a reusable straw. I'm going to have 3 pipes running the same path, but the third will continue forward, so there will have to be a T-connection there. For that, I just carved the end of another receipt roll so that it looks like it connects to the side of the other. Then I glued the pipes together using hot glue and cut the ends to length. I mentioned before that it was way easier to build the pipes onto the board from under it, so I cut away these parts. I used a spoon to gouge out the foam in an angle so that it looks like the pipes continue under the ground. With enough clearance, I could glue the pipes in place and fill the holes from below with the offcut pieces. I did some testing off camera and shoved some aluminium foil under the pipes, mostly in places that my brush wouldn't fit, so that I have no yellow foam peeking out after the paint job, and so that when I later add sand, it just won't fall through. I also painted some Mod Podge mixed with black paint from under the holes to protect the foam from spray paint. Anyway, I got the pipes laid out how I want them, so I can fill the negative areas with stuff. I used offcuts of the board that already had the bricks cut into them to fill some shallow areas like the middle crater. I tried to use the shapes that fit the pattern, but that way that they have shifted and broke the pattern a bit. Then I used the better part of 2 cork pan coasters from IKEA to rip pieces and fill the deeper areas. And then I used some thinner cork pieces to fill in the remaining gaps. Cork gives the ground beneath all the rubble a nice shattered earth texture. I initially thought I would fill it with some sculpting clay, but the added weight and how much I would need of it is way too much, so I went with this lighter and cheaper option. As a last step for the building I can do so far, I placed some sheets of corrugated cardboard around. Mainly some areas that were too uneven, looked like they needed more detail, or I just didn't have the patience to fill up with cork. The idea is that someone has dragged sort of makeshift bridges out of corrugated sheets of metal on top of all that rubble, so it's easier to traverse. I glued normal card sheet under the corrugated card to make it more durable and hot glued them in place. Time to add some color and protection to everything built so far. I say Mod Podge because that's what everybody knows and seems to use. Any decoupage glue, sealer or whatever does pretty much the same. It's going to protect the foam from melting when I use spray paint, and it also makes everything a bit more durable. I mix water, sealer, black paint and a dash of wood filler for some fine texture. The black paint is there so I can see that I got it everywhere. And if I don't reach all parts with a brush later, at least it's going to be black. I start with a smaller brush to get it in all the gaps, and then use a big old brush to fill all the large areas. I go around a part at a time, first getting it everywhere, and then I stipple it with a big brush to remove the brush strokes. The next step I did, I would take back if I could, but if somebody is taking notes, please just use sand. Remember, I'm no pro at this, just documenting what I did. I only had 1 grain size of sand at hand, but I wanted variation. For bigger stones I used some cat litter. It's got a nice shape to it and the size is what I'm looking for. I've used it in basing before, no problem, but not on this large scale. The issues are that it's very absorbent and brittle, and also it may dissolve a bit if it gets wet, so I'll have a lot of fun with it in the painting steps. I did the next few steps on the balcony because of the fumes and the dust, and I was using some good protection, but I don't have a lot of footage of it. With the cat litter filling the biggest gaps, I added some fine-grained sand on top, and then dripped an ungodly amount of thin superglue to lock it in place. I was worried that using a lot of PVA would not have it dry completely, and didn't want to wait a few days to see what happens. I used around 30 small tubes of superglue all in all, which is insane. And while it's not expensive, around 10 euros worth combined, it feels wasteful and I feel a bit bad about it. So maybe use something else instead. With the sand glued in place, I glued some Green Stuff World resin printed skeletons to hide here and there. I wanted it to look like they had tried to hide in the pipes and whatever cover they could find from the bombardment. With everything glued, I let it dry on the balcony overnight, of course. As some last ground texture between the bricks, I sprinkled on some used coffee ground that I have baked in the oven to dry it and kill whatever's left in it. I used a big brush to sweep it in between everything. Then I sprayed some isopropanol alcohol on top to break the surface tension and dripped some thinned PVA glue with a pipette. I probably should have done all of the steps until now before the Mod Podge layer to prevent all the future problems, but hindsight is 2020, so let's move along. I took the whole thing out for a black prime, and after it dried, I glued it finally in its place using some construction adhesive. Now that I have the edges in place, I could build the last details. I wanted to make a nasty death pit in one of the corners. All of the bodies and random trash that would be on the streets has to be dragged somewhere out of the way. First, I added some toxic barrels that have been rolled into the hole. These are from an early 2000s Citadel kit, Battlefield accessories. I've just had them laying around for a while, or a few whiles. I also glued a bunch of skeletons in different poses that have either got stuck in there or has been dragged there after a battle. I used bits of cork, small rocks and some corrugated card to make the ground very messy and varied, and added some miniature barbed wire tangles in between. That's a pit you don't want to fall in if you don't have your vaccinations in order. I'll have to leave the last detail for way later. I need to paint almost everything at first. Painting this board had a lot of steps that made the previous steps redundant, and I did a lot of trial and error before I got it the way I wanted it. I'll go through the main steps with you and leave most of the back and forth out. I mixed black and a lot of poor pigmented white and added a few drops of brown and bone white miniature paints for a more natural earthy grey. It turns out that not all craft paint is equal. I bought these very cheap from Lidl and they really gave me a lot of headaches. The white paint had the coverage of milk, so in comparison to the black I had to add it at least in a 5:1 ratio to make a deep grey. I covered the whole board with 2 thick base coats of this slurry. Then I used the same technique as with the Mod Podge. After covering an area, I went back with a brush and stippled it to remove all brush strokes. After it had dried, or so I thought, I made a wash of brown paints, mainly speed paints and water. And I slabbered it all over everything, but focusing more on the rubble parts. And then I left it dry overnight. In the morning, I was greeted with this view. Not sure if the craft paint had separated or if this was the cat litter dissolving, but now I had this white chalky substance all over and in the gaps. I decided I'll go on with the tiles and figure out the gaps later. Spoiler alert, I painstakingly painted all the gaps darker with a brush off camera to get rid of the white. I ran out of the white craft paint already in the last step, so it's time to go bankrupt using miniature paints. Okay, just kidding. I'm only using some nice 15-year-old pots that have somewhat dried and gotten chunky already, and that I wouldn't put on miniatures anymore. The pigments in these are much more intense than the craft paint, and just a few drops make a difference. I used a piece of packing foam and sponged the lighter grey all over. Then added more white and tan to the mix again and did a more selective sponging with a ripped piece of packing foam. And then repeated that step with a slightly lighter layer of sponging. This uneven sponge leaves behind a stony looking transparent texture that adds up the more you do it. I don't own an airbrush, but this next step really made me want to buy one. I was tired of going all over the board with a brush, but I needed to put down another wash to darken everything a bit. I mixed a wash out of water, contrast medium and dark brown and black contrast paints into an empty bottle of grapefruit scented body mist. Even though I rinsed it thoroughly, a scent of grapefruit filled our apartment that evening. Once I had it all covered, I used a paper towel to dab the excess pulling off. I didn't want it to get too wet either, since another problem I had with the craft paints was that it seemed to reactivate with water even the next day of laying a coat. The next day, after the wash had completely dried, I did some final selective sponging with the last grey I used. Then I added a bit more tan into it and gave the whole board a heavy dry brushing. I tried to keep my brush strokes straight on the concrete to give it some realistic looking streaks. Finally, I used only a tan color to lightly dry brush everything, and while I had it on my palette, I base coated all the skeletons with it. Then I washed them brown and painted some highlights on them with off-white. I was pondering on should I make the pipes more of a brass color or a rusty steel, but either way a brown base coat can't go wrong. I painted all the barrels, pipes, metal sheets and barbed wires with contrast wildwood. I almost like them like this. The small grain with the contrast paint made them very yucky and rusty with minimal effort. But minimal effort is never the way I do things. I painted some patchy and scraggly highlights with iron breaker to all the top facing parts of the metals. Now that they were way too shiny, to dull it down I used some technical paint, typhus corrosion. And before it had time to dry, I wiped some of it off messily with a paper towel. Lastly, on the metals, I repeated those steps with a very thin orange paint for some fresh rust. I don't remember which brand of paint this is, but it dries much duller than it looks fresh, so I used it generously. The board was looking almost finished, but this next step is where I really messed up. This extra work could have been avoided if I did this way earlier in the steps, but hindsight and all that again. I wanted the ground look kind of like a red planet, rich with iron oxide. I've used pigment powders on bases before and they're pretty easy to work with. This board, in the other hand, has so much working area and a lot of texture, so it made things a lot harder. I also made the mix way too thick, and after slabbering it on, I had to commit. It does not look as red on camera as it is really, but I was so frustrated and really wanted to rage quit then and there. I covered all the rubble and the earth texture with a mix of AK dark rust with water, and then I let it spread out onto the tiles close to those areas. Then carefully painted it between all the gaps of the tiles too. So far so good, but getting the excess off the next day was a nightmare. I dabbed it with a wet microfiber towel at first, and then quickly went back with a dry one to lift most of the pigments off. The rough texture of the board didn't let me get into all parts, and the water was again reactivating the craft paint that I had almost painted a week ago now, so the board was left with some bald spots. I found that rolling a damp microfiber towel like a Swedish meatball was the best way to go, and it got most of the pigments off without rubbing the paint too much. After I got the majority of it off, I had to retrace a lot of steps from before, so again, some sponging, washing and dry brushing, to get the board looking the way it did. It isn't that red anymore, mostly dark brown, but this looks better in my opinion. I focused the last dry brushing and sponging on the edges of the tiles. It tricks the eye to think that the craters are a bit deeper than they really are. With the board looking right and all the sinkholes painted, I can finally add the last details. I want the pipes that are intact but still showing to make sense, so they would have to be protected somehow. I think in the grim darkness of the far future, that sort of precaution is necessary, so that you don't have to worry about a few bombs when transporting your goop from a factory to another. I wanted to cover some of the pipes on the board with a protective netting, like there's been a service tunnel underneath that has been exposed. I kept the intact netting mainly on the play area that has received a lot less impacts. This will also make the board more playable when miniatures can stand on it. First I traced the holes on the netting with a pen and then roughly cut it into shape. Then I trimmed it for a tight fit and then squeezed it in place. Then I lathered on super glue to the parts that didn't want to stay in place and sprinkled on some baking soda to instantly cure the glue. In some parts I had cut a bit too much off, so I placed pieces of cork to hide them. I scattered a lot of offcuts of the grating across the death pit and other craters and tried to make them look like there has been netting but it's been torn off. Then I used some texture paints to hide some of my less obvious crimes and mix the edges better to their environment. For painting, I used the same recipes as before to blend in the texture paste and the cork. And the netting got the same treatment as the other metallics. Finally, I painted the edges of the board black and took it outside for a spray of matte varnish. And the board was done. I had a lot of fun crafting this side of the board, and I want to make some industrial buildings soon to accompany it. Tell me what you think below, and if you have an idea on what to make on the other side of the double-sided board, write that down there too. Small creators that do long-form videos are really having a hard time getting reach on YouTube right now. So interacting with the video is always appreciated. I have a few videos that I've been working on simultaneously with this one, and I will drop them out whenever they are ready. So subscribe if you want to see what I'm up to next. Thanks to all the 557 of you that have already subscribed. I'm over halfway to 1,000 subs, and I've heard that that's the hardest goal to reach. Anyway, I'm going to keep painting my minis, you paint yours, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching.